Hola, ¿qué tal? Bienvenidos a todos a este webinar. Les está hablando Paola Delgado, gerente de vinculación corporativa para la iniciativa Science Based Targets. Este es el segundo de 3 webinars que hemos preparado para empresas en México y también el resto de Latinoamérica. La serie se llama Preparando a su compañía para la acción climática. Como comentamos en el primer webinar, actualmente los socios de la iniciativa en México estamos colaborando para promover la iniciativa y para facilitar la adopción de este tipo de metas. Los socios de la iniciativa SBT o Science Based Targets son CDP, WWF, WRI y el Pacto Global de las Naciones Unidas. ¿Puedo yo darle la siguiente? Siguiente, por favor, Aline. Gracias. El día de hoy tocaremos el tema de emisiones alcance 3 o emisiones en la cadena de valor. Esto en relación con la adopción de metas ambiciosas que realmente nos ayuden a cumplir los objetivos del Acuerdo de París. Y el día de hoy nos complace mucho tener a nuestros invitados, en primer lugar a Juan Carlos Camargo, subdirector de sustentabilidad y responsabilidad corporativa en Walmart de México y Centroamérica. Juan Carlos nos va a contar de la experiencia de Walmart en este tema de emisiones alcance 3, principales retos y beneficios. También tenemos a Cynthia Cummins. Ella es Director of Private Sector Climate Mitigation en WRI Internacional. Ella nos va a hacer su presentación en inglés y nos va a hablar un poquito de cómo empezar a contabilizar estas emisiones de la cadena de valor o emisiones alcance 3, así como los principales criterios de evaluación de emisiones alcance 3 en la iniciativa Science Based Targets. Y por último, tenemos a John Detling. Él es Global Director Services and Innovation en la empresa Quantis. Él nos va a hablar de un tema muy interesante que es la herramienta Scope 3 Evaluator, que sirve para justamente estimar las emisiones alcance 3 o de la cadena de valor. Entonces, siguiente diapositiva, por favor. Solo para mencionarles que estos son los puntos de contacto de la iniciativa en México. Un representante de cada organización, si tuvieran dudas o interés en este tema y quisieran más información, nos pueden contactar. Siguiente, por favor. También quisiéramos recordarles que el tercer webinar de esta serie de webinars tratará de las estrategias de reducción de gases de efecto invernadero adaptadas para la ambición de SBT. Una vez que uno fija una meta de Science Based Target, pues obviamente hay que fijar una estrategia de cómo alcanzar dichas metas. Entonces, este tercer webinar está dedicado totalmente a la parte de estrategias de mitigación. Siguiente, por favor. Y como primer presentador tenemos a Juan Carlos Camargo. Él es subdirector de sustentabilidad y responsabilidad corporativa en Walmart de México y Centroamérica. Una pequeña reseña. Juan Carlos es responsable del desarrollo de las estrategias de sustentabilidad de la compañía, así como de la coordinación de proyectos de generación de cero residuos, mitigación de cambio climático y promoción de cadenas de valor sustentables. Cuenta con 20 años de experiencia profesional y tiene 2 publicaciones, una sobre prevención de la contaminación en la industria química y otra sobre la implementación de estrategias de sustentabilidad en la industria del empaque. Él es ingeniero químico por la Universidad Iberoamericana y maestro en ciencias en administración y política ambiental por la Universidad de Lund. Sin más, damos comienzo a nuestro seminario. Bueno, perdón, una pequeña nota es que vamos a tener 3 tiempos de preguntas y respuestas que ustedes pueden escribir en chat o en la sección de preguntas. Nosotros las leeremos en voz alta en estas 3 secciones de preguntas y respuestas. Intentaremos cubrir el mayor número de preguntas, si no podemos enviarlas después del webinar. Y solamente una pequeña nota que tal vez las preguntas de Juan Carlos tengamos que dejarlas para el final, ya que tendrá que salir un momento después de su presentación. Bueno, ahora sí, sin más, comenzamos este webinar y Juan Carlos, muchas gracias de nuevo. Te cedo ahora la palabra para que comiences con tu presentación. Listo, ya te puse unmute.
Ahora sí. Muchas gracias. Muy buenos días. Espero que se escuche bien. Primero, muchas gracias por la invitación. Un placer compartir nuestra experiencia en este tema tan apasionante como las emisiones de alcance 3, que en sí mismas son un reto. Les quiero platicar un poquito primero de nuestra estrategia de sustentabilidad a grandes rasgos y dónde estamos poniendo nosotros el énfasis en el trabajo que estamos haciendo en este tema. ¿Me dan la siguiente, por favor? Nosotros hemos definido unos compromisos hacia el 2025 que corren en 3 pilares. Uno tiene que ver con la no generación de residuos, y esto lo entendemos como no enviar residuos a los rellenos sanitarios o a incineración, sino que se pueda establecer ciclos cerrados de materiales. El segundo objetivo, y que tiene más que ver con la materia de esta sesión, es nuestra ambición es abastecernos al 100% de energía renovable. Y más puntualmente, nosotros como compañía global hemos definido un objetivo basado en ciencia de reducir 18% nuestras emisiones justamente para el 2025. Y esto está soportado porque el 50% de las operaciones globales de Walmart, no solamente Walmart México, sino Walmart en todo el mundo, serán abastecidas con energía renovable. Cabe mencionar que Walmart de México lleva un poquito de ventaja con respecto al resto de los mercados donde opera Walmart, porque nosotros ya tenemos un consumo del 70% de energía renovable, y esto es lo que está apalancando principalmente poder avanzar en nuestro objetivo de reducción de 18% de las emisiones. Y el tercer pilar donde estamos enfocándonos es en la parte de productos. A final de cuentas, somos una empresa que comercia con productos, y lo que buscamos es que estos contribuyan a sustentar los recursos naturales y el medio ambiente. Y tenemos 3 iniciativas claves. Una es nuestra ambición de poder evitar 1 gigatón o 1,000 millones de toneladas de emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero al 2030 en las cadenas globales de Walmart. Esto quiere decir que no solamente es en México, sino en todas las cadenas de valor de la compañía. Evidentemente, también nuestra ambición es abastecernos de manera sustentable de los productos que son claves para nuestro negocio y de tener empaques que sean 100% reciclables. Entonces, me voy a concentrar justamente en aquellos que tienen que ver con las emisiones. Entonces, ¿me pueden dar la siguiente lámina, por favor? Y la verdad es que el trabajo que hemos hecho en nuestra operación ha sido muy satisfactorio los resultados, porque hemos logrado separar el crecimiento del piso de ventas de las emisiones de carbono. Entonces ustedes pueden ver la gráfica, salvo el año 2017 que tuvimos una afectación en el abasto de energía renovable debido a los sismos de ese año. En realidad nuestra tendencia es hacia la baja y estamos en una posición de mantenerlo así, a pesar de que todos los años estamos abriendo nuevas tiendas. Nosotros lo consideramos como uno de nuestros grandes éxitos, el poder haber llegado a este nivel, por lo menos en nuestras emisiones, en la operación directa, de poder separar este crecimiento tanto en México como en Centroamérica. La que sigue, por favor. Pero entonces viene el tema de las emisiones de alcance 3. Y en este pie ustedes podrán ver más o menos cómo se reparten las emisiones de acuerdo al mapeo que nosotros hemos hecho. Y lo hemos hecho siguiendo la metodología del GHG Protocol, de WRI, en donde fuimos mapeando en nuestra operación y en nuestra cadena de valor aquellos rubros que eran significativos en la generación de emisiones. Y son justamente estos seis categorías, sin incluir los productos, porque ahorita vamos a hablar sobre el tema de los productos. Entonces, como ven, tiene que ver mucho con el tema de transporte y un poco en la generación de residuos. Y básicamente, cuando no incluimos la elaboración de los productos que comercializamos, el peso de nuestras emisiones de alcance 3 tiene que ver con la distribución de los productos. Cabe mencionar que Walmart de México no posee una flota propia de transporte y todo es subarrendado. Por lo tanto, por eso consideramos que ese transporte corresponde a una emisión de alcance 3. Y ahí es donde hemos visto las mayores oportunidades y las ventajas de empezar a medir las emisiones justamente en este rubro, de decir, las emisiones evidentemente están asociadas, nosotros lo vemos con dos elementos, lo vamos a hablar un poquito más adelante, pero tiene que ver con el consumo de combustibles y con el uso de la capacidad máxima de los transportes de carga, básicamente. Y a partir de ahí hemos diseñado diferentes estrategias que, por un lado, disminuyan nuestras emisiones, ¿no? Justamente reduciendo el consumo de combustible y aprovechando el espacio del transporte. Haz la que sigue, por favor. Cuando nosotros agregamos el componente de los productos que vendemos en tienda, entonces el pie cambia completamente. Y el 90% de las emisiones de alcance 3 son justamente las que nos reportan nuestros proveedores que nos suministran los productos que vendemos en nuestras tiendas. Aquí cabe mencionar que nosotros somos miembros del programa de cadena de suministro de CDP y a través de este programa es que hemos empezado a involucrar a nuestros proveedores, uno, para que midan sus emisiones, identifiquen, establezcan objetivos, identifiquen riesgos y entonces podamos ir entendiendo, ¿no? Cómo se compone nuestra cadena de valor en el tema de emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero y cuáles son los riesgos y las oportunidades asociadas a esas emisiones en los diferentes sectores de los productos que nosotros vendemos, ¿sí? Entonces, para nosotros ha sido una pieza muy importante ser miembros de esta iniciativa de CDP porque nos ha empezado a arrojar luz sobre lo que sucede en nuestra cadena de valor. Y nosotros tuvimos el enfoque que hemos empleado, este año es el cuarto año en que somos parte de la iniciativa y lo que nosotros con lo que hemos trabajado es el 80-20, ¿no? Ese 20% de proveedores que generan el 80% del volumen de nuestras ventas, ¿sí? Aquí cabe mencionar que Walmart tiene más de 35,000 proveedores. Entonces, para poder involucrar a todos en este proceso, pues es una tarea que incluso yo me preguntaría si los sistemas de CDP estarían habilitados para soportar tal cantidad de respuestas, si es que en algún momento todos los proveedores estuvieran dispuestos a responder. Pero más allá de eso, lo importante es que esto nos ha dado un entendimiento de dónde nosotros vemos que hay oportunidades de trabajar con nuestros proveedores para reducir las emisiones. ¿Sí? Entonces, cuando hablamos de que hemos podido separar nuestras emisiones del crecimiento de nuestro negocio, sí, sí son emisiones directas. Si son emisiones, si agregamos las emisiones de alcance 3, no hemos logrado ese reto, ¿no? Estamos todavía muy atrás. La que sigue, por favor. Lo que les platicaba un poquito, un componente muy importante de cómo nos ha beneficiado el empezar a medir las emisiones de alcance 3 es en el tema de logística, distribución de los productos. Hemos desarrollado dos iniciativas principales que tienen un impacto directo con la generación de emisiones de carbono, y una tiene que ver el uso de logística inversa, y el otro es con un esquema de backhaul. El logística inversa, lo que hacemos es aprovechar los camiones que reparten la mercancía en nuestras tiendas para que retiren de las mismas tiendas materiales de empaque para que estos puedan ser reciclados. Y entonces eliminamos la necesidad de duplicar viajes o de tener camiones en vacío por las carreteras. Y la segunda iniciativa, que es backhaul, es similar a logística inversa, pero aquí lo que hacemos es coordinarnos con algunos de nuestros proveedores para que nuestros camiones que distribuyen la mercancía a tiendas, si coincide la ruta de distribución a tiendas con un centro de distribución de un proveedor que esté incorporado al programa de backhaul, entonces nuestros propios camiones pasan a recoger la mercancía que ese proveedor nos iba a entregar en el centro de distribución, eliminamos esos viajes y nuestros propios camiones llevan la mercancía al centro de distribución después de haber entregado o de haber completado su ruta a tiendas. Entonces, este es un elemento muy importante de entender cómo las emisiones van ligadas con el uso de combustible y otros elementos, y podemos obtener beneficios económicos directos. La que sigue, por favor. Y la última parte que les quiero comentar es el próximo lunes hacemos el lanzamiento oficial en México del proyecto Gigatón. El proyecto Gigatón es una iniciativa de Walmart a nivel global para eliminar 1,000 millones de toneladas de emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero para el 2030 en sus cadenas globales de valor. Estamos muy entusiasmados porque aquí se trata de involucrar a nuestros proveedores a desarrollar proyectos de reducción de emisiones. En primer lugar, a comprometer una meta, un objetivo de reducción, y en segundo lugar, que la ejecuten. Y nuestra aspiración, evidentemente, es que un buen número de proveedores puedan establecer metas que estén basadas en ciencia. Así que después les vamos a pedir apoyo a Paola y a su equipo para que esto pueda ser funcional y que nuestros proveedores se puedan involucrar en esa iniciativa. Y me dan la siguiente, por favor. Y el proyecto básicamente tiene 6 áreas en donde los proveedores pueden desarrollar iniciativas de reducción, que es el consumo de energía en sus procesos. En la agricultura, mucho enfocado, por ejemplo, el tema de ganado o el uso de fertilizantes. Evidentemente en el tema de residuos, con un componente muy importante en desperdicio de alimentos, empaques, ya en la fase de uso del producto, y también un elemento en commodities que están relacionadas con bosques o con la deforestación. Entonces, de tal manera que ellos pueden desarrollar proyectos que eviten la deforestación. Creemos que con esta iniciativa no solamente es la idea de poder contribuir a los compromisos del Acuerdo de París, de mantener la temperatura o el incremento de la temperatura por abajo de 1.5 grados centígrados, sino que eso también nos va a dar la posibilidad de tener una cadena de valor mucho más resiliente, más flexible, más adaptada a los retos que vienen, y que puedan realmente responder ágilmente a estos cambios tan bruscos, por ejemplo, en climas. Nosotros vendemos alimentos y somos nuestros proveedores son muy sensibles a los cambios extremos de temperatura, lluvias, sequías, etcétera. Entonces, creemos que esto nos fortalece como empresa, el que los proveedores puedan medir sus emisiones y puedan empezar a reducirlas. Creo que es un paso muy importante, no solamente para reducir nuestras emisiones de alcance 3, sino para que ellos mismos puedan tener una operación mucho más eficiente, más limpia y más resiliente. Con eso terminaría mi presentación.
Muchísimas gracias, Juan Carlos. Súper interesante y felicidades por el lanzamiento, un poquito adelantado al lunes,
Sí.
de su proyecto Gigatón. Sí tenemos una pregunta muy buena, no sé, creo que tienes 3 minutitos, no sé si podrías
Sí,
respondernos esa pregunta.
claro que sí.
Y sí, perfecto. Tenemos una pregunta sobre, me parece que se refieren a la meta global de Walmart, ya que Walmart ya tiene tiempo de ser parte de las empresas aprobadas en la iniciativa Science Based Targets y nos preguntan qué es lo que han logrado y alcanzado con esta meta global. No sé si conozcas un poquito más al respecto de esa meta global y también cómo la han implementado o tratado de implementar en México.
Sí, y es una pregunta súper interesante porque en realidad en Walmart, como compañía global, tenemos este marco de objetivos, ¿no? Que son aplicables para todos los mercados en donde opera la compañía. Pero también cada compañía tiene la libertad de hacer las adaptaciones y, y desarrollar los proyectos que considere pertinentes para poder llegar a ese objetivo. Entonces, no necesariamente en cada uno de los países donde está Walmart tenemos los mismos proyectos. En ocasiones sí, en ocasiones no. Y entonces los niveles de avance de cada país puede ser diferente. Les puedo decir que en general la tendencia es parecida a lo que está sucediendo en México de poder separar el crecimiento de la compañía del crecimiento de las emisiones. Si mal no recuerdo, andamos entre un 3-5% de reducción de las emisiones con respecto al año 2018 contra 2017. Y entonces hay países en los que han trabajado muy fuerte, sobre todo en el abastecimiento de energía solar, por ejemplo, ¿no? Ese es un caso de Estados Unidos, a diferencia de nosotros que trabajamos con energía eólica. Y hay otros países que han trabajado muy fuerte también con el tema de reducir las emisiones de su flotilla cuando tienen una flotilla, como puede ser el caso de Walmart en el Reino Unido. Entonces, en general, tenemos un avance positivo hacia nuestra meta. Lo vemos como un reto importante, un reto en donde sabemos que ya no es, a final de cuentas, un porcentaje de reducción que se decidió aleatoriamente, sino que esto es una aportación real, con un impacto real hacia una causa en común, ¿no? De todos los países, ¿no? De todos los negocios y de todos los países. Entonces, esto nos ha hecho movilizarnos, ¿no? Para desarrollar proyectos que sean muy aterrizados, que tengan un impacto muy claro y que nos ayuden a avanzar hacia nuestra meta.
Perfecto, muchísimas gracias. Quizá una última preguntita antes de que te vayas y que
Venga.
regreses nuevo al final.
Sí.
Guardamos las demás para el final, pero aquí hay una pregunta de si Walmart ha trabajado o ha considerado fomentar procesos de mejores prácticas agroecológicas con los productores de tal manera que se garantice el menor porcentaje de cambio de uso de suelo.
Sí, sí, totalmente. Y tenemos diferentes proyectos y voy a hablar del caso de México porque, de hecho, en Walmart en otros países tiene avances muy importantes en ese sentido. Nosotros tenemos diferentes programas con agricultores y sobre todo hemos trabajado mucho con agricultores de pequeña escala, ¿no? Que son muchas veces los más susceptibles de poder empezar a buscar estos espacios para expandirse, ¿no? Y hacer el cambio en el uso de suelo. Y sí hay todo un programa de compartir mejores prácticas, no solamente en cómo llegar a la calidad que nosotros estamos requiriendo para vender el producto en tienda, sino de una manera que sea mucho más sostenible, y no solamente en el uso de suelo, sino también en el uso de fertilizantes y otros agroquímicos. Entonces, y nosotros la ambición que tenemos es que a partir del proyecto Gigatón podamos extender más estas prácticas hacia otros productores que se quieran sumar y que juntos podamos intercambiar también experiencia de cómo ir avanzando en este tema.
Perfecto, muchísimas gracias. Te dejamos las preguntas, las preguntas que nos han llegado al final. Juan Carlos, te esperamos. Gracias.
Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias. Entonces ahora continuamos con la agenda. La siguiente presentación va a ser de Cynthia Cummins. Ella nos va a hacer su presentación en inglés, por tanto también voy a leer su biografía en inglés. Cynthia Cummins is Director of Private Sector Climate Mitigation in WRI. She manages various projects working with businesses to reduce GHG emissions, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and the Portfolio Carbon Initiative. More than 18 years of experience working on the issue of global climate change. Prior to WRI, Cynthia was the Director of Carbon Management at Clear Carbon Consulting and the founding director of the US EPA's Climate Leaders Program. Cynthia holds a MPA in Environmental Policy from Columbia University in New York City, and BS from Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. I don't know if I pronounced it correctly, but thank you very much, Cynthia, for being today with us. I will now leave you the floor to commence your presentation.
Okay, thanks, Paula. Hi, everyone, and thanks to all the SBTI Mexico team for organizing the webinar and all the efforts you're doing to inform companies on the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And it's great to see the growing interest of companies in Mexico on science-based target setting. So just for some level setting, I just wanted to, in case some folks on the phone are not familiar with GHG protocol and the categories of emissions, I thought I'd just do a quick review of that before we dive deeper into scope 3 target setting. So the greenhouse gas protocol, which was developed by WRI and WBCSD in partnership with hundreds of stakeholders around the world, has developed standards for how to measure and report greenhouse gas emissions. And we've developed these like 3 buckets of greenhouse gas emissions. So the first is scope 1. So these are all your direct emissions that are on site within a company's boundaries. So this is from just any kind of combustion of fuel on site, process emissions, and emissions from any fleets of vehicles that a company may own or lease. And then scope 2 emissions are emissions from purchased electricity, heat or steam, or cold water. So these are in a category of indirect emissions. And then the other major category of indirect emissions are scope 3. And within scope 3, we've come up with 15 buckets or categories of emissions. Some of these are upstream of a company's operations and some we consider downstream, but these cover all the emissions from cradle to grave, from all the products that a company may purchase and sell within a year. So because as you know, all companies' inventories are generally a 1-year time frame, a 12-month time frame. So these are emissions from all the goods and services that a company purchases and sells in a year. Okay, next slide. And why are scope 3s important? As you heard from Walmart, this example here, Levi's, for many companies, scope 3 is the largest emission source, especially from the types of companies that we see setting science-based targets. So you can see here, this is another example of a scope 3 inventory, this one from Levi's, and you can see where their own operations, so their scope 1 and 2 emissions are like they consider them 1% of their total emissions, and the rest are all in scope 3. And they don't categorize their scope 3 emissions quite like we do in scope 3. They've come in the scope 3 standard, they've come up with a slightly different categorization here, but you can see that most of the emissions are from purchased goods and services, so the goods and materials that are upstream that they use to produce their clothing, and then in the indirect emissions, consumer use from the washing of the clothing, and very small emissions associated with their own operations. Okay, next slide. So why do we care about scope 3 emissions in the Science-Based Targets Initiative? So as I said, for most companies, or many companies, depending on what sector the company is in, the majority of emissions are in scope 3. So while the Science-Based Target Initiative focuses the science-based target setting around scope 1 and 2 emissions, we think for a company to demonstrate leadership and to have a credible ambition on climate, that they need to also include scope 3 emissions in their targets when they're significant. So what we require all companies to do in the initiative that want to participate is to at least do a screening of their scope 3 emissions. So some high level estimate of all 15 categories, or all the categories of scope 3 emissions that are relevant to their business. And then based on the screening, if they identify that 40% or more of these emissions of total emissions are in scope 3, then companies are required to set a scope 3 target. We say these targets are ambitious. We don't right now define these targets as science-based targets. We only say that now about scope 1 and scope 2 targets. And the boundary of scope 3 targets are 2/3 of total scope 3 emissions. So we know it's hard to go after, especially when companies are just starting out, to go after every category of scope 3 emissions that they have in their inventory. But we just want companies to go after the largest sources. And so to get at that, we say companies can set one or more targets around scope 3, but they collectively have to cover 2/3 of scope 3 emissions. And then we allow 2 types of scope 3 targets: emission reduction targets, just like for scope 1 and 2, and then we also allow this other alternative approach, which we call supplier engagement targets. Okay, next slide. So option 1, which are emission reduction targets. So just like for scope 1 and 2 targets, we say the time frame has to be 5 to 15 years into the future from the date the target is submitted for validation. Now, we picked the 5 to 15 year time frame because we think this is forward-looking enough that it gives companies time to make larger capital investments, but it's short enough time frame that the current staff within a company that are setting these targets will have some accountability for them, and which makes these targets more actionable. And there's different types of targets that we allow, and based on the type of target, emissions target, there's different types of levels of ambition that we use to assess them. So the first is an emissions-based target that's using this method that we call absolute contraction, which is an absolute reduction target in line with an IPCC scenario. For scope 3, we just say the minimum level of ambition right now is based on a 2-degree scenario. We do encourage companies to Also think about using a well below 2 degree scenario or 1.5 level degree of ambition for if you wanted to set an absolute reduction target. For a 2 degree target, which is the minimum level of ambition, we say that's equivalent to a 1.23% annual absolute reduction. So for example, if that was a 10-year target, that would be a 12.3 absolute reduction over that 10-year period. Now, there's many companies that find intensity targets more palatable, I would say, easier to get approval internally for, and because it doesn't necessarily hamper growth in the same way as an absolute target would. So, there's different options for how to set an intensity target. So we say intensity targets have to be in line with keeping temperature increase below 2 degrees. We do have this one method called the sectoral decarbonization approach, which we call the SDA. This is for physical intensity targets in homogeneous sectors. And it doesn't work as well for scope 3 because scope 3 emissions are so diverse, but it is useful for a couple sectors, like the automobile sector, for example, where the majority of emissions are in the use phase. We do have a sectoral pathway for the transport sector. It also can be really useful for a real estate development company, for example, where we have a 2 degree pathway for commercial building space. So for that sector, the most of the emissions are in the use of the building. So for some select sectors, the SDA is useful for setting a physical intensity target. So that an example of physical intensity would be like emissions per ton of steel, emissions per ton of cement, emissions per square meter for building space. So then the next approach, and when a physical intensity target doesn't make sense because there is no physical metric to use, and the SDA doesn't apply, you can use an economic intensity approach. So we have one method that we call GIVA that was developed before the initiative existed, and we've modified that for our purposes. And for that, you need to include what your anticipated growth rate is to calculate this method, as well as for the SDA. But what the output would have to be a target that has an annual intensity improvement of 7%. So it's emissions like per dollar value added. And also in addition to that, based on the growth rate, it needs to translate to an absolute reduction in line with 2 degree pathway. And then the third option here is for other types of physical intensity targets. So if you wanted to set a target that's like emissions per unit of product, a more generic physical intensity denominator. For this method, we also need to understand what your growth rate is, and would say that the target can't translate to any absolute emissions growth, and it also has to lead to a 2% annual physical intensity reduction. So that's like a method that we think leads to ambitious reductions, but you couldn't say that that method would be aligned with science. Okay, next slide. So here's some examples of those various methods. So here's Levi Strauss again. You can see for their scope 3 emissions target, they set an absolute reduction target in line with the absolute contraction method, a 40% absolute reduction. And then SECO here, the second one, you can see is an economic intensity target. And it's around a specific categories of emissions. So some companies will set targets around all their scope 3 emissions, and some companies will set targets around specific categories, scope 3 categories, which is fine, just as long as collectively the targets cover 2/3 of scope 3 emissions. And you can see this third one here, Royal DSM, they've set a physical intensity target, so 20% reduction per ton of product. And you can see all the targets are publicly available on the website. So you can see there's now a couple 100 targets, more than 200 targets that have been approved, and the majority, about 90% of them, include a Scope 3 target. So you can see lots of examples on our website. Okay, next slide. Okay, and then here is the second option, supplier engagement targets. And this works really well for companies where they have significant emissions in their tier 1 of their supply chain, and they may have suppliers that aren't very far along on this evolution of measuring and managing emissions. So the idea of this type of target is to encourage your suppliers to set science-based targets themselves. And that just then helps proliferate this concept of ambitious target setting across the whole value chain. So we say that the targets have to be 5 years maximum, and this is because we don't think it takes that long to get a company to set a science-based target. They have to do an inventory and then set a target, but they don't actually have to achieve reductions. So we think a shorter time frame makes much more sense here. And then for level of ambition, we say at a minimum, you have to get your suppliers to set science-based targets around their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. They could include Scope 3, but that's encouraged but not required. So the boundary is just Scope 1 and Scope 2. So that means that companies don't necessarily have to, those suppliers don't have to come to the SBTI and get their targets validated. You just need to have some way to track whether they're using our tools to set science-based targets around Scope 1 and 2. And then the target just needs to include what percentage of emissions or procurement spend is covered by the engagement target. So like, it could be like, we set a target to get 70% of our suppliers by spend or by emissions to set a science-based target themselves by a certain date. Okay, next slide. So there's a number of tools that we've made available to make it as easy as possible to set a Scope 3 target. So for emissions reduction targets, you can use the SBT calculation tool that's freely available on our website. And you can see here there's a tab for Scope 3 target setting and the 3 options for emissions-based target setting. You can use any of those options to set a target using this tool. Okay, next slide. And then there's a whole host of GHG protocol standards and guidance that can be very helpful to, at least in setting your baseline. If you haven't yet done a Scope 3 inventory, then you should go to the GHG protocol Scope 3 standard. And then there's also this technical guidance for calculating Scope 3 emissions. So it goes in this guidance, for every category of emissions, it'll give you different recommendations. There's no requirements on how to calculate these emissions, but we provide multiple recommendations for each category on how to calculate your emissions and create a full Scope 3 inventory. And then there's also the corporate scan standard and a Scope 2 guidance that came out a couple years ago that provide more details on how to calculate emissions from purchased electricity. And next slide. And John Detling is going to talk more about this tool here, but this is a great place to start for companies that just don't know how to get going on figuring out what their Scope 3 inventory is. We worked with Qantas to develop this tool called the Scope 3 Evaluator. It's freely available on GHG Protocol website. This tool will give you a great high-level estimate of your Scope 3 emissions for all the major categories. And we recommend that once you understand where your big emission sources are, you're going to go back and get better quality data for those larger emission sources. And if you're going to set a target and track performance over time, you're going to need more specific data for those categories of emissions that are in the boundary of a target. But this is a great place to start. It's fully in conformance with the Scope 3 standard, and for your smaller categories of emissions, you could continue to use the output from this tool to report your inventory every year. Next slide. And this is my final slide here. So this is one other resource. This is out that Gold Standard, an NGO, led the development of 2 years ago, and Science Based Targets Initiative helped develop this along with them and others. And this is just this is a best practice guidance document on target setting and also how to achieve your target. And you can see here the chapters of the guidance document, and the guidance tries to provide some best practices, case studies, and some helpful recommendations about how to apply these different types of efforts to reduce emissions in Scope 3. And with that, I'll turn it back to Paula. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Cynthia, for your presentation. I have one question for you. It is about the evolution of Scope 3 inventories. So based on your experience, how has been this evolution actually? If you can comment more on that, and more or less how much time it takes to go from an initial screening to more formal inventory.
Yeah, okay, yeah, great question. So I mean, what we see is companies are still, the Scope 3 standard came out in 2012. And even when the standard came out, companies were generally just kind of cherry picking, like just picking a couple categories to measure and put in their inventory. And then once the Science Based Targets Initiative came out in 2015, and we started to require companies to set Scope 3 targets when those emissions were significant, we're now seeing this proliferation, this rapid growth of companies using the standard and completing a full Scope 3 inventory. But what we are seeing is companies continually generally are setting their baseline, their base year inventory in Scope 3 using like input-output data, this like third-party average data. We're seeing this now that companies have targets in place. We have so many, like close to 200 probably or more now Scope 3 targets in place, and companies now have to achieve those targets. They now have to track progress against them, and they need more primary data or supplier specific data. And so we're seeing a real demand for better data and better accounting. So there's one effort that the Gold Standard has going on where they've been working with us to develop a new accounting framework for Scope 3 that helps companies account for like what we're calling supply chain interventions. So when the companies don't have a lot of transparency in their supply chain, but they want to make an investment somewhere to reduce those emissions, how can they invest in a project and get and count it towards their Scope 3 inventory or their Scope 3 target? So we're seeing a lot of evolution in this purchased goods and services category, which is so significant for many sectors. But we still see a real need for more transparent supply chains and more access to better primary data. So I see as more and more companies set Scope 3 targets and this demand increases, that there'll be more data availability will happen, and more hopefully technology innovation will happen to enable more transparent supply chains.
Thank you, Cynthia. Very, very interesting. We also have another question, whether the initiative is also checking on progress of targets. Yeah, if you want to
Yeah,
answer that one.
yeah, right. Yeah. So now that we have a lot of targets in place, a lot of companies have approved targets. We're getting this question more and more. Originally, we didn't really see ourselves as a place where we would be like validating whether a company met a target and really tracking progress. Our job was really to raise ambition. But we're now seeing that there's a gap out there to better monitor these targets and how companies are doing in achieving them. So to start out with that process, this year we're going to be in December developing a progress report on the initiative to show how the initiative is progressing, but also to start doing some assessment of companies' targets and what kind of progress they're making. It's a very initial effort, and over time we'll be developing more robust approaches to tracking progress against companies' progress against their targets.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. Thank you for your great presentation. We are now going to move to the next presentation, but at the end we might open some more space for more questions. But thank you very much. Okay, so if we could go to the next slide. We are now going to hear from John Detling. He is Global Director, Services and Innovation at Quantis. John leads the new service innovations at Quantis, which is a leading sustainability consulting firm where he works with a wide range of companies to develop leading sustainability strategies. He has also supported leading NGOs and initiatives such as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol of WRI, the Sustainability Consortium, UN's Global CEO Mandate, WWF, EDF, and others. Prior to Quantis, he was project manager for toxic substances programs at the Great Lakes Commission. And John holds an MPH in Environmental Health Sciences, from the University of Michigan, and a BS in Biology. Thank you very much, John, for accepting to present today. I will now give you the floor.
Great, thank you. It's great to have a chance to talk with your audience today. I think my comments will be relatively brief. I'll try to move through quite quickly. I think that a decent amount of what I have to say is similar to a lot of what Cynthia had presented. So I'll try to add a few new points or comments, but not try to be very redundant. Great, so I'd like to talk a little bit about the importance of Scope 3 footprinting and provide a little bit of additional detail beyond what Cynthia provided about how to get started in the field of Scope 3 footprinting, and especially how to take advantage of some of the tools, especially the Scope 3 evaluator that was mentioned before. And you can move on to the next slide. Great. To think about corporate accounting and scope both 1, 2, and 3 footprinting, one of the analogies I like to use is the idea of running a company without a financial budget. If you were to think about putting yourself in the shoes of a CEO or senior vice president, and you're trying to make significant decisions about the performance of the company, but you have no financial information with which to make those decisions, I think you could quickly see how difficult it would be to lead that company to good performance. And I think the very same thing applies in the environmental and sustainability space. If we're trying to make decisions to help the companies perform well in those spaces, but we have no good numeric information to help guide us, we're really constrained almost to only being able to use guessing as a basis for defining what would be the right actions to take, what amount of progress we've made, et cetera. And in the financial space, corporations derive so much ability from the use of clear metrics to be able to set targets, to chase targets, drive performance, et cetera. And so carbon accounting in the climate space is an essential tool for helping us take those same approaches of being able to set targets and drive the organization towards them, and lets us apply those tools to addressing big issues like climate. You could move on to the next slide. Great. So Cynthia had already given us an overview of scope 1, 2, and 3 accounting, so I won't go into more detail about that other than to very quickly summarize as a reminder in case anybody's new to the space. Scope 1 accounting is really the direct emissions from your owned facilities, owned vehicle fleet, et cetera. So it's carbon emissions that are really coming out of physical assets that your company owns. Scope 2 would be the emissions associated with the production of electricity that you use. And so those emissions aren't coming out of your own operated assets, but they're ones that are very directly related to the electricity usage going into your facilities. And then scope 3 is really the rest of the value chain. If you wanted to go to the next slide, we have a little bit more expanded view of what's included there. Essentially, the value chain emissions, or scope 3, are everything else that you could classify as being upstream or downstream in delivering the products or services that you sell. And so this is the entire supply chain, all the things included in getting goods to your company, in getting your product out to the market, in your customers or end users using your product, waste disposal, et cetera. And so depending on the type of company you have, the elements of what's in scope 3 and what's important might vary somewhat. You could move on. Thank you. These results give some examples of the relative importance of different scope 3 categories and how they compare to scope 1 and 2, which are shown in gray. These results, I believe, come from the pilot testing phase of the scope 3 protocol, and they show different companies and different sectors as a breakdown of their estimate of their overall emissions. I think it's quite interesting to look at both what's similar and what's different between different sectors, and it may give some initial ideas about what might be important for your company. One thing that stands out quite clearly is that the scope 3 emissions for most companies are much larger than the scope 1 and 2 emissions combined, and that echoes what Cynthia had mentioned on the same topic. We do see, though, that for some companies, in the example here, construction and materials, the scope 1 and 2 targets are more significant as a proportion to others, and that, of course, that makes sense for some sectors, depending on what type of operations they're managing. This also gives a little bit of detail within the scope 3 categories and being able to identify the importance of different categories there. A few things that stand out. The one that jumps out most clearly is the light blue near the bottom of the charts. That's purchased goods and services, basically the supply chain of companies. And this is the category, I think, most often that we see being the largest category in scope 3. And for some companies, it can be the great majority of the whole value chain emissions are part of their supply chain. The other category that jumps out as being important for many companies, not all companies, is category 11, the use of sold products, which is the purple color that you see near the top of some of the charts. And that applies especially to companies where the people using what they sell are responsible for significant amounts of emission. You could think of, for example, an automotive company or a company that manufactures airplanes as a good example of where the use of their product is very likely to be where the majority of emissions will be. You could move on. Very briefly, to echo some of the comments earlier about the importance of looking at the full value chain of including scope 3, there's a lot of benefits from having these emissions within the view. In fact, going back to the analogy of being blind to the numbers in your company, having only scope 1 and 2 data, as we saw on the prior slide, only gives you a very partial view and may actually bias you from thinking in the right way about where your emissions are and where the best opportunities are for your company to be to be a difference maker in the climate topic. And so having a view of the whole value chain gives us that big picture. And one of the benefits of that is allowing us to focus on what's most relevant. Again, if we were to think about that prior slide, and we think about trying to manage carbon emissions for a company, but we're only looking at the scope 1 and 2 emissions, we would know that for many of those companies, we're missing where the biggest improvement opportunity might be. And so the scope 3 view helps us make sure that we see as comprehensive a view as we can. It also, having this big view allows us to connect better to big picture global goals. Science-based targets are a great example of that, where we're trying to engage companies to do their appropriate part to address this big picture challenge, and trying to connect what we need to do across the globe to reduce carbon emissions to what portion can each individual company contribute. And if we don't have that full value chain view, it's difficult to make that connection from all companies to the global goal. So it really helps us add relevance to what we're doing on the climate topic. Another very significant benefit is that this view helps us think about and promote shared ownership of the actions that we would take. There's so many of the actions that we need to take on climate that are potentially influenced or can be influenced by many entities that share the same value chain. And so this shared accounting approach that we see in scope 3, where the same emissions are a part of the same scope of each company across the value chain, really encourages those companies to collaborate to find solutions. This might mean, that if companies in the supply chain need to incur a cost to reduce emissions, having those emissions in the scope of each other company in the value chain creates some incentives for those costs to be shared within the value chain, and hopefully leads to more opportunities for improvement. And so this focus on the value chain has companies communicating more proactively with companies, not only to get data to estimate emissions, but also about solutions. And we've seen that already be a big benefit in many of the scope 3 discussions around the action plans needed to meet science-based targets. You could move on to the following slide. So that brings us to the question of how to get started in estimating your scope 3 emissions. And you could jump ahead to the next slide where we give an answer to that question. This was mentioned in, I think, both of the prior conversations. The scope 3 evaluator is a tool that we launched about 5 years ago as a collaboration between Qantas and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. It's a freely available tool on the web, and the idea is that it allows any company to make a first quick estimate of their scope 3 carbon footprint. So it allows you to get over the first, often quite difficult step of just getting an estimate of what your emissions are, and hopefully gets companies then on a pathway of being more focused and being able to try to start to set targets and start to focus on actions around the most significant categories. It also allows companies to start to be smarter in how they invest their efforts to better estimate their scope 3 emissions by providing a first general hot spotting of where the impacts are. Companies are able to better focus their efforts to get smarter in the areas where it's relevant, and to some extent not pay so much attention to those categories of scope 3 that they can quickly prove are not significant for them. And the idea is that this is a tool that any company in any sector, anywhere in the world would be able to use, and that it could be done with a few hours of data entry. It might also take some more time to collect the data you need to enter, but in terms of actually getting in the tool and putting your data in, our intention is that it could be done in actually much less than 1 day of work. If you move on to the next slide, we talk a little bit about the design plan for the tool. I think this is important to highlight because we get a lot of questions about the tool, a lot of which have to do with the limitations of the tool. It's not by any means a perfect tool. It's not intended to be the best estimate you can get of your Scope 3 emissions. It's really intended to be a simple tool that gets people started with a first estimate. And so the things we've tried to design the tool around are to make sure it's freely available and therefore using freely available data, that it's simple to use, very approachable, that it provides people a quick first estimate, and again, that it could be used by any company anywhere in the world to do so. And you can imagine trying to meet all of those requirements, that there are some compromises in what the tool does. Those are that it's not customized for any given industry. It certainly doesn't provide the most accurate results that you can get. There's lots of ways that you can go beyond the Scope 3 evaluator to get better estimates of your emissions. It doesn't provide very highly detailed modeling. A lot of the things, for example, in the supply chain, it's asking you to categorize your company's spending in pretty broad categories. And so it's not going to give you a very, very detailed view of what's within each category. It also doesn't itself enable long-term tracking of goals. It's really intended to be the first step of the process. It might give you good enough information to help you set science-based targets, but you'll really need to be looking for better ways to be tracking and accounting your emissions as you track progress towards science-based targets. So again, really a starter tool. If you move on to the next slide, we've got a quick view of the tool, which I think is similar to what Cynthia had shared. The URL is here, and you can also find it just by Googling Scope 3 Evaluator and Greenhouse Gas Protocol. I'm sure we'll probably make the link available as part of the follow-up materials as well. As I mentioned before, it's a free tool, and so you can just go to the site, you can create a login. That login allows you to return to the tool later and start right where you left off. It saves your data within your account. And so once you've created an account, the menu will lead you through a series of different questions about your company that collect the information needed. Some of the questions might be not applicable to your company, which would mean that you probably don't have emissions in certain categories. And then once you've done all of that, the tool will display a set of results that gives you a breakdown of your Scope 3 emissions by the 15 Scope 3 categories that have been mentioned. And so again, it's a very nice first place to get started in estimating your Scope 3 emissions. I think that's all I have in terms of prepared remarks. I can hand it back over to take a few questions, or maybe switch to the questions for the full panel.
Thank you very much, John, for your presentation. A very interesting tool and very useful. There are two questions for you. The first, I will just read them out loud. The first one is if Quantis provides any type of support while companies are using the tool. And the second one is how different it could be, the results of this tool compared to a GHG inventory.
Yeah, very good questions. On the first one with regard to support, another of the limitations of it being a free tool is there's really no budget set aside to provide support. We do have a technical help email address, but we're really not able to really coach people through the process or answer very detailed questions. That's really intended for if people are having technical issues with the site, so they can communicate to us and we can attempt to fix those bugs. Of course, at Quantis and at many other providers, we do provide help with Scope 3 emission setting, so that's also an option, but not what I'm here to talk about. With the other question with regard to, could you repeat the second question?
Yes, so this tool helps companies to screen their emissions in the value chain, so do a high-level screening. But how different it could look compared to a GHG inventory?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So, it does provide you with what I would call a GHG inventory. My way of thinking about it is that it's a good tool for providing you what's really a pretty bad estimate of those emissions. Meaning that I think it does the job that it's intended to do well, but the job that it's intended to do is not necessarily to be very accurate. I would expect that if a company invested a lot of its own time or money to do, a more professional estimate of Scope 3 emissions, just as a rough guess, I would think that you should expect, a difference of maybe even 50% in the total emissions numbers due to the inability to estimate everything so accurately at a very high level. So really what the tool would tell you is, are your total emissions 100,000 tons per year, and as opposed to 1 million tons per year. But whether, it's 100,000 or 110,000 or 120,000, I don't think it's being accurate enough to do that. So the other thing that it provides you that's of a lot of value is the relative importance of different categories, to especially be able to go from that list of 15 Scope 3 categories and to understand that for your company, maybe 10 of the 15 are extremely small, and it's really only 5 that you should put more focus in, and then to invest most of your effort in terms of getting better numbers on those several categories. So in general, again, I think it gives you a nice estimate, but it should really be viewed as just a first rough estimate. And I would suggest that even for science-based target setting, it would be a good investment of your time to try to improve those numbers, especially in the biggest hotspots, before moving further.
Thank you very much, John, for your presentation and for your answers. We will now move to the final Q&A. So I will switch a little bit into Spanish to provide a recap of the 3 presentations, and then I will read the final questions out loud, okay? Thank you very much, John. Okay, so I will switch to Spanish now. Lo que me gustaría hacer ahora es una pequeña recapitulación de lo que los 3 presentadores el día de hoy nos hablaron al respecto. El día de hoy el seminario fue de las emisiones alcance 3 o Scope 3, que son las emisiones en la cadena de valor. Algunas de las reflexiones más importantes es que estas emisiones para muchas empresas y para muchos sectores son las emisiones mucho más relevantes en términos de peso y es importante empezar a estimarlas, ya que dentro de la iniciativa Science Based Targets pedimos que las empresas fijen metas de alcance 3 si estas emisiones son mayores al 40% de la huella total de la compañía. Y la huella total es la suma de las emisiones de alcance 1, 2 y 3. Entonces, por eso tan importante las presentaciones del día de hoy. También importante recapitular sobre lo que nos comentó Cintia, sobre los criterios que tenemos en la iniciativa para fijar metas de alcance 3. Hay 2 tipos de metas que aceptamos en la iniciativa para alcance 3. Las primeras son metas basadas en emisiones y la segunda es metas de vinculación o involucramiento con proveedores para que estos mismos fijen metas basadas en ciencia. Creo que algo muy importante de mencionar es que la iniciativa Science Based Targets provee esta herramienta gratuita para modelar metas de alcance 3. La pueden bajar de la página de internet y esta herramienta lo que hace es modelar metas de alcance 3 de emisiones. Entonces, por ahí hay 3 tipos de metas de emisiones físicas, de intensidad física, de intensidad económica y absoluta. Los invitamos a revisar la herramienta. Y para conectar con la presentación también de John, El primer paso que ustedes pueden seguir para estimar sus emisiones en la cadena de valor es utilizar esta herramienta de Quantis, que les va a dar una estimación, una aproximación de sus emisiones por cada una de las categorías de alcance 3 que se presentaron. Y con eso es suficiente, al menos para someter metas a validación a la iniciativa. Obviamente hablamos también de la evolución de los inventarios de alcance 3. Al principio pueden ser una estimación, pero una vez que fijas tu meta, pues para poder hacer el reporte o el progreso de las metas, será necesario ir detallando más ese inventario, utilizar información de primera mano de los proveedores. Entonces, es ahí donde pueden empezar, pero después será toda una trayectoria a seguir, ¿no? Después de hacer la primera estimación de emisiones alcance 3. Y hay muchas oportunidades de trabajar con estas emisiones y con los proveedores en la cadena de valor, como lo presentó Juan Carlos en su presentación. Y más o menos esta fue la recapitulación de nuestro webinar el día de hoy. Por último, voy a hacer las preguntas que quedaron pendientes. Voy a empezar con Juan Carlos. Juan Carlos, hay dos preguntas para ti sobre las implicaciones de costos y esfuerzos internos del proyecto del Gigaton y qué tan difícil ha sido avanzar con el proyecto dada su magnitud. La otra pregunta para ti es si han planeado exigir a las compañías que tengan empaques ecológicos. Entonces, Juan Carlos, te damos la palabra.
Sí, gracias. Bueno, contestando la primera pregunta, en el caso del proyecto de Gigatón, nosotros apenas vamos a empezar el lunes con la iniciativa. Evidentemente, lo que nos demanda a nosotros internamente es una participación activa de nuestro equipo de compras. Si nosotros apostáramos solamente a que el equipo de sustentabilidad hiciera el trabajo para sumar a los proveedores, no lo podríamos hacer, o sea, somos 4 personas, entonces es imposible. La idea es de que nuestros compradores sean la parte activa de trabajo con los proveedores, sea parte de sus conversaciones cotidianas, así como pueden hablar de precios y propuestas comerciales, también puedan platicar sobre las metas del proyecto Gigatón y los avances que están teniendo de acuerdo a los compromisos. Entonces, esa es la parte más importante. Afortunadamente, una de las ventajas que tenemos como compañía global, estamos apalancados con muchos de los desarrollos en sistemas que han hecho nuestros colegas en Estados Unidos, y tenemos un sistema bastante amigable en línea para que nuestros proveedores, uno, puedan ingresar, sumarse al proyecto y puedan también empezar a cuantificar sus emisiones con herramientas más o menos sencillas y las puedan ingresar su reporte de avances. Entonces, yo no lo vería como una gran carga en costos, más bien es un trabajo muy interno, organizativo y de involucramiento de las diferentes áreas que tienen contacto con los proveedores. Y la pregunta 2 sobre empaques sustentables, nosotros somos firmantes de la Declaración Global sobre Plásticos con la Ellen MacArthur Foundation, y estamos comprometidos evidentemente a hacer que todos los empaques de nuestras marcas, para empezar, sean 100% reciclables, y no solamente desde el punto de vista que tengan el potencial de reciclarse, sino poder construir alianzas y colaboraciones y hacer que el sistema realmente pueda recibir esos materiales para reciclar. Estamos trabajando con nuestros proveedores, desarrollamos guías para ayudarlos a que ellos sepan qué cosas sí, qué cosas no incluir en sus empaques y que puedan hacerlos mucho más reciclables. Entonces, es una iniciativa que tenemos en marcha. Nuestro objetivo es al 2025 y tiene el componente de que los empaques sean 100% reciclables, dos, que contengan al menos un 20% de material reciclado, y tres, eliminar aquellos plásticos que son o difíciles de reciclar o que no son necesarios. Sí.
Muchísimas gracias, Juan Carlos. There's a question for John. John, they are asking if the tool is applicable for conglomerates that participate in different industry sectors.
It's a good question. It does ask you to specify your sector, I believe, in doing the tool, but I don't see a reason why you wouldn't be able to do a footprint for a company that included multiple sectors. A lot of what it asks you, for example, is to classify your purchasing in terms of monetary spend across different categories, to classify the spend or amount of transportation included in the supply chain. I think a company like that, if we looked at, I don't know, a very, very broad company like a BASF that has many different, is active in many different sectors, they might have a choice of either creating one account and looking at the whole company as one, or if they find that it works better for them, they could potentially create a representation of each business unit within the company. But certainly it would have the ability to make estimates for those types of companies.
Excellent, thank you very much. There's a question for Cynthia, but actually that I would like to invite Cynthia to answer first, but then also invite you, John and Juan Carlos, to answer after Cynthia's response. And this is, why would you recommend companies to set a science-based target and also scope 3 targets?
Okay. Yeah, that's a big question. There's lots of reasons for companies to set targets, but it depends on the company, the sector, and the culture of the company. But companies are setting them for all sorts of reasons. One, to reduce risk, because they see the transition risk that's happening and they want to address it and be prepared for the future. They see what the future looks like, and to have a social license to operate in the future, they know that taking aggressive action on climate is needed. They may see risk in their supply chain from climate change, and they want to support the reduction in risk to their supply chain. Or there may be a demand from their customers, or demand starting to come from their investors. We're seeing more and more investors asking, what are companies doing to reduce their risk from climate change? And also specifically asking companies, do you have a science-based target? So we see the demand coming from all sides on a company, even like you see like with Amazon recently, their employees are now sending letters to the company management executives and demanding that the company take action, more aggressive action on climate change. So it's coming now, it's even coming from employees, and a way to retain good employees is also another reason why companies are now taking a leadership position on climate. So the reasons are growing, but it really depends on the company and where they sit within a value chain, whether many companies are taking action just for corporate reputational benefits. And that's what I would say most of the companies joining our initiative are ones that are doing it for the reputational benefits. But the investor demand, customer demand, employee demand, that's growing as well.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. A great answer. I don't know, John, would you like to also answer this question?
Yeah, Cynthia, I thought, gave a really good response, so I don't have very much to add. I think the main thing I would add is that I would classify reasons for trying to be aggressive on the climate topic, of which I think science-based targets is one of the most significant ways currently that companies can be very aggressive in addressing that topic. I would classify the reasons into doing it for purposes of being a good citizen and doing it for purposes of, the direct benefit to the company. I think Cynthia did a great job of summarizing the many reasons why taking these kinds of actions is actually very good business and therefore directly beneficial to the company. I think we do also see a decent number of companies out there that do things like this purely to be a good corporate citizen. And just as each of us as citizens, are willing to do things that might be somewhat of a sacrifice to ourselves in order to do something necessary or important to create a good community, it's, there's the same expectation for corporations, and many corporations have that attitude themselves that they want to be a positive part of the community. So I think there's also that citizenship aspect I would add. And I think the level to which that's important relative to financial benefits certainly differs very much from one company to another.
Thank you, John. Thank you for the additions. And I will invite also Juan Carlos to answer this question if you like. ¿Por qué recomendarías a las empresas fijar metas basadas en ciencia y también incluyendo metas de alcance 3?
Sí, yo creo que es más allá de todo lo que dijeron John y Cynthia, que lo cual estoy totalmente de acuerdo. Sí hay un componente de reputación, de mantener la licencia social para operar. Creo que hay un elemento claro que es cómo aseguramos la continuidad de la empresa y entender que la empresa no vive aislada, sino que está expuesta a una serie de riesgos que vienen originados en buena parte o magnificados por el cambio climático. Y entonces que si queremos, ¿no?, continuar con nuestra operación y ser capaces de adaptarnos a los cambios que vienen, es fundamental tener claro cuál es nuestro impacto y poder cuantificar también de forma certera el impacto positivo que podemos tener derivado de las iniciativas de reducción de emisiones. Por lo tanto, yo creo que un objetivo basado en ciencia es un primer paso para darle certeza al trabajo, darle claridad y que esté respaldado y no se vea como una ocurrencia, sino como algo sólido que tiene un impacto significativo.
Muchísimas gracias, Juan Carlos, por tu respuesta, y a los tres ponentes el día de hoy. Thank you very much, Cynthia and John, as well, for joining this webinar. Estamos ahora concluyendo el webinar. Solo un par de notas. Muchísimas gracias por su participación. Les estaremos enviando las diapositivas, así como la grabación de este webinar, concluyendo el webinar. También los invitamos a que se registren para el tercer webinar que está enfocado en las estrategias de mitigación para alcanzar estas metas ambiciosas Science-Based Targets, así que no se lo pierdan. Bueno, pues simplemente agradecer a todos, recordarles que aquí estamos el equipo de Science-Based Targets México para apoyarles. Los esperamos ver que se unan a la iniciativa, y si no pudieron atender el primer webinar, también tenemos la grabación de ese primer webinar. Así que sin más, les deseo a todos un bonito día. Thank you very much. We are concluding the webinar.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Gracias.
Gracias.
Sí.
Okay.